Hello, this is Dr. Catherine Close, and today I'm going to chat about some of the concepts that we encountered in chapters 4 and 5 of this week's studies. As we know, we're talking about accounting information systems. We're going to be introduced this lesson to the structure of databases, which is a very important concept. Many of us will be put in charge of our databases at our organizations, whether we're corporate controllers or public accountants. We'll be assisting clients in setting up their accounting information systems. So it's important we know how this data is stored, how we access it, and how we protect it. We're going to talk about some of that too in this class. So let's take a look at chapter 4. We start with the concepts of online transaction processing and online analytics processing or analytical processing. So the easiest way to think of that, we often call these by their abbreviations. So let's begin by taking a look at chapter 4 and some of the key ideas that we come across. So we begin by looking at two different types of online systems. One is transaction processing and one is analytical processing, or basically we can call it transaction versus report processing, because the OLTP systems actually record transactions. So that's where our debits and credits are coming in, and any of the economic transactions that we're recording, that's where we're actually seeing those being posted to the ledgers and things like that. And then in the OLAP side of it, when we're running reports and analytical processing, that's where we're actually going to see more like queries and presentations and visualizations. So that's usually, both of them are real-time types of systems, which is important to remember. And but one will actually be recording those transactions and another will be reporting on them. So keep those vocabulary terms in mind. So when we think about information systems, we often think about levels within systems, or different, we'll hear references to different types, right? The broadest overall umbrella is that they're information systems, but they sometimes have different orientations or different functions and different users and what they use them for. So if we look over to this area of our idea board, we have this concept of, at the base is the transaction processing system. Has the broadest level of access. This is where we said we have the debits and credits coming into the system, the transactions, the history of the transaction is building. This data is coming from all different parts of the organization. If it's a retail operation, it's coming from the cashiers on the front line all the way to people in the back office inputting exceptional transactions and things of that nature. So we're building up that data. And then we're going to turn that and transform that data into useful information as we use it and pull it into our other systems. So as we go up the pyramid, we have management information systems. So we have middle management. They're looking for to pull data, to turn it into information, to make tactical decisions, right? So they're pulling reports, they're pulling financial statements, summary reports. So we're getting into the kind of OLAP reports and analytical processing side of the online system. Then as we keep refining this data and moving it into more and more information, we then get into specialized systems like decision support systems used by upper level management that does a little bit more strategical and non-routine analyses and decision making. So we might even have models being created in these systems. This is where a lot of business analytics occurs, right? And we're looking at data analytics, business analytics. We might be adding in artificial intelligence to explore scenarios, to look at what if assumptions, to create, as I said, models, forecasts, and projections to help make the more strategic long-term decisions of the organization. And then the highest level is executive support systems. This is used by highest level leadership to make, once again, more non-routine and long-term decisions, right? So it could have highly customized dashboards that we're looking at. We're not really generating transactions at this stage. We're up in the report and analysis area. So high-level summaries, customized reports and information that are key to the leaders of the organization. So with it, in the broader category of types of systems, we have level of systems and their kind of expertise and what they can lend to us in our role as accountants, financial managers, executives. The other thing I want to point out about these levels, we said it's a pyramid, right? So the foundation, the transaction level, the TPS has to be solid. There's this old time saying I kind of hate, but it's sort of so true: garbage in, garbage out, right? In terms of computer systems or data systems, it's the case. We have to build all these other reports and decisions on good data. Good data revolves around good internal control. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, and you're certainly going to pick up a lot more about that in auditing. The next area that we'll talk about as we go through the concepts and the ideas in chapter 4 is batch versus real-time processing. So we have all this data out here. We have all these economic transactions going on. We need to record them. So this is where I get to tell my stories, if you've ever had me in class, right? In my day, when I entered the field in the 80s, we did something called batch processing in relation to the accounting cycle. So we were gathering the transactions, we were recording them, but we couldn't actually access them at that moment to see financial reports. We couldn't access them real time. So what would happen is the business transaction would occur, we record it, it would create a file, we'd update the file as we needed to, and then periodically throughout the month, and then again at the end of the month, we'd schedule a batch process or a batch posting. So at those times, our systems actually had to be shut down, right, for us to record all of that. And then from that point, the database was updated and we could query it and run reports. So the big thing in accounting was closing at the end of the month to produce the financial statements. So years and years ago, sometimes big organizations, their accounting cycle would shut down. Nobody could do any work until the batch was processed. And sometimes it took hours and hours and hours, right? And then they couldn't close the books until they, once again, had all the adjusting entries and trial balances updated again through this batch system. What has evolved, which has been extremely helpful and has also allowed us to access information real time and to close more quickly, is real-time processing. So in real-time processing, these debits and credits are being posted all the time. So I'll talk in our early accounting classes, I'll talk about what happens when you go into TJ Maxx, right? From the scanner where they scan your purchase, they are recording 4 transactions, 2 debit and credit transactions, 1 to sales and 1 to account for inventory. That's real time. We could then step over to a report writing system and see those sales posted live. Whereas before in batch processing, that wasn't the case. So more and more we are in a real-time processing environment, which is really helpful to us. When we think about softwares, and I tell this story maybe in the announcements or whatever, another thing is, like in the mid-90s when I took my AIS course, it was all about what software are you using, right? Are you using at that then? Some of the leaders, for example, in this area, because of government, would have been Deltec or SAP, Oracle. QuickBooks was just coming out into the market, right? So it was all about accounting softwares. Now we're more driven by not just the accounting software, but the languages under them, understanding the interface between the software and the components and the people within our organization. See, accounting information itself is actually that whole environment of software, connections, networks, and people and users. So when we look at this, we need to be familiar. We don't have to be programmers, but we need to understand that there's programming language, there's system software, and then there's the actual application software or for us, it's the accounting software. So program languages, Java, HTML, Python, C, C++, they're all still out there because a lot of AIS systems for larger companies are customized and written for them. Some of these technologies we don't go to very much, or these programming languages we don't go to much very anymore, but they're still out there and they're still running, right? So sometimes you'll hear stories, for example, there was several years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was major concern about the DC payroll system because it was actually customized and created so long ago. We don't see Java used much more on the internet, right? So things that were written for online application in Java had to be converted. Python, R, they're all languages now that are very popular, specifically for writing analytical programs. So they may be skills that you pick up later if you wanted to, but certainly to have a little bit of an understanding, pick that up on the job is a good thing. The system software are kind of, the overall umbrella that connects everything. When I studied AIS, we used to see a picture of spaghetti, right? This was all our legacy systems, all these systems that didn't that we used, but they never talked to each other. And now we see this node, right? Node network system, because that's what we're doing. We're taking our various softwares and we're forcing them to talk to each other. Compatibility and networking and keeping it all connected is the top priority. And we'll see that when we talk about ERPs too, because we're going to see that we're putting different types of systems together. So the system software are what the drivers, the big drivers of the overall. We were always focused on application software. Now we need to know a little bit more. But our accounting application software would be our QuickBooks. Now, there's an emerging product. It's probably 5 years old now, Xero, SAP, longstanding. NetSuite, one I worked with extensively, was just purchased by Oracle, or there's in-house highly customized developed systems, right? So we have some risks related to software, and we should be aware of them when we're searching. And, that's another thing. We used to study a lot of time about the procurement, how to procure software, and we've replaced that now in our modern AIS environment with risk and control. So more from the audit side, right? But the idea is we have to be aware that as we're connecting all these pieces together in this beautifully integrated system, we're going to have issues that might come up, like third-party software. There could be copyright infringement. You could have somebody coming into your system. You can have downtime on their end as we're outsourcing, right? Or offshoring even our different systems. And then when you develop software yourself, right? There's just a level of complexity to handling that on your own. So we're going to talk about this in a little while in our discussions, a lot of software implementations fail. And they fail because of things like scheduling, budgeting, not having the right technical specifications, fraud, a lot of different things can come into play. And we as accounting and finance managers have a broad view of these types of risks related to these principal types of software. So probably one of the biggest developments, certainly that I lived through in my career, was the transfer of the accounting application from the in-house desktop environment to the cloud, right? So now it's very common for companies to outsource their accounting function. Even when we saw the influx and the use of QuickBooks was a relatively simple and easy accounting software to install and to run in-house. But as we wanted to start to do things like interact with business partners, interact with our banks and things like that, or just startup costs, right? Even for a QuickBooks, to customize it to fit the unique properties of some firms, it just became advantageous to let a third party host or to send your accounting systems to the cloud. So cloud computing is probably one of the biggest changes that I've seen in my career. And we get to then see the different types of cloud computing, right? There's public, private, hybrid, right? We have, private is going to be highly customized. There's going to be high security. Public, a lot of the Amazon platforms that people use now. Intuit allows you to run your books on their system. So this is going to be readily available. It'll have lower costs. And then we certainly have these hybrids, which a little bit of, well, I might need to keep this closer to me in-house. And secure times, I'm going to transfer it, and parts of it are going to live in the cloud. So all of this comes with things we have to consider, like reliability, downtime, right? Is it accessible? Amazon Web Services, that has to be 24/7 around the world, right? Same thing with a lot of our multinational accounting systems, right? It has to be, you're going to have people all over the world accessing them. We need privacy. That's one of the biggest areas that we now see more and more of when we have incidents where our accounts receivable files were taken. The security of our customers is at stake. The security of our data is at stake. And then there's all these risks, related to using cloud services. But yet, if we structure our internal control environments carefully enough, and we're sensitive, and we're always responsibly checking in on these things, this is what makes our businesses go faster. And faster business means faster transactions, means faster profit, right? And so this is a very important the cloud, I don't think we'll see go away in a very long time. It lowered the hurdle for a lot of companies to come into business. You might have studied that in your business courses, right? The hurdle to get in. No longer, if you were like a construction company, you had to invest in bringing a big system in, like Deltek or something, to track, which is a very complicated accounting area. You could now subscribe to accounting services online that were developed specifically for those industries and access them through the cloud. So it took away capital hurdles and allowed people, individuals, to come into business more quickly, which we see as a big advantage. Certainly having to have staff, right? Now, that is probably the biggest misunderstanding or misconception is the word I'm looking for in terms of using the cloud, right? You still need somebody in-house who's responsible for the internal control, the security, the privacy, all of that data, right? Just because you are storing it elsewhere, the company does not abdicate it's a responsibility in that area. And that's early on. That's where a lot of a misunderstanding and misconceptions were, right? So yes, your partner, your cloud partner, if their system goes down and loses transactions and they can't back it up, that's problematic. But guess who has to solve the problem for the company? It's their representative. One of the we all probably understand one of the or remember that one of the first functions in accounting to be outsourced to the cloud was payroll, right? ADP, payroll companies like that. But there's always still a payroll department internally and a principal contact, right? That's providing the information to the payroll processor and monitoring the accuracy of the payroll processor. So cloud is still very much, it's a necessity, but it's also still our responsibility. In audit, you may learn about the special audits that go around this, or excuse me, in audit, you may learn about the special types of attestation services that go around these kind of cloud contracts. Because in the end, it's still the company's responsibility to maintain adequate internal control over these areas. So one of the things in the book that I think is interesting and very important to pull out is, how do small businesses use these technologies? And I'm going to make it very simple because it's something I stress in most of my classes, right? Excel is often the foundation of accounting systems for small companies. It's their entry-level technology. And from there, as they master Excel, improve in Excel, excel in Excel, they get the confidence to move into other systems. And that system could be something like, I mentioned, QuickBooks, right? Early on, first of all, QuickBooks was novel. It was breakthrough. But early on, auditors hated it because it didn't have an audit trail, right? It didn't have a good way of tracking who went in and changed things. So from a bookkeeper's point of view, it was terrific because you could go in just back to the original transaction and edit it, right? Whereas in old systems, you'd have to back out the debits and credits, put the correct ones back in, and but that left an audit trail. You knew who was in your database, who might have been, at what steps they took. You know, a bookkeeper could go in to correct something with all good intentions, right? And it didn't work out the way they intended, right? They booked the entry backwards or something like that. So the biggest criticism of QuickBooks over many, many years was its lack of audit trail. Now it's one of the most beneficial systems to small and mid-sized businesses. It has its different flavors now. It has a nonprofit. I believe it has construction now too. So this is why and the cloud services have really opened it up. So it's known to be reliable. CPAs have hundreds of clients working with it, but we still have the bigger systems, right? So we need to always be designing ways to control access to our systems, right? So we may have talked, you may have heard in your earlier classes where we talk about segregation of duties, right? So usually the horror stories you hear in companies is, you know, one bookkeeper is small firm, QuickBooks, and, you know, 15 years later, they find out this person who they thought was really reliable had been doing something unsavory, right? There was nobody in there. There weren't the proper internal controls, right? Segregation of duties. Even in a small shop, you have to figure out a way that somebody does the work, somebody checks the work, right? And you have to think in those terms. Taking vacations, mandatory vacations, right? Sometimes you hear stories, well, they never took a vacation. Well, why do you think, right? Well, because they didn't want something to be discovered. Physical access. Why do we have all these security codes, passwords, and that? One of the great benefits of our systems now is that they're role-based, right? So if you work in accounts receivable, you're not going to have access just at the general ledger generally, right? So your access, your physical access is based on what you do. And then, kind of logical aspects of that, right? And workflow aspects of it that we want to see that help protect the system. So really being able to start to think about how do I protect the data in the accounting cycle? And that's why auditing is an additional kind of specialized area of an accounting, right? Um, and AIS more and more is included in that because it has become a tool for auditing, right? One, if we are putting the proper internal controls around our accounting information systems, we will have things in place that provide us with evidence as to other things that are happening that maybe shouldn't, right? We will be able to confirm transactions. We'll be able to spot unusual transactions. We'll be able to see patterns in the data. That's why business analysis is now been kind of integrated into understanding of AIS concepts. And then we will also be able to use different types of auditing tools on the system itself. So in more advanced classes, there are, you'll learn how to, they call it, we originally audit through the computer, right? We're using computer programs to pull data, to see anomalies, to see errors, and that's what the auditors go back and check on. From our point of view, if we're managing the database, right? That's why we need to understand if they see duplicate payments, we need to understand our internal control and how we process payments and what authorizations we use and what tables are involved in the database so we can understand what the auditors are looking at. And we can help detect what might have been an error, something unintentional, something intentional, right? And we can help them investigate. So I mentioned earlier that in early studies, we often spent time writing things like RFPs, which would be public announcements that were wanted to acquire an accounting information system, what features it needed to have. That isn't something we're going to do in this class, but it is very likely something you could run into in the real world. And that's why understanding, well, can I bring in, can I integrate this module with that? And that's another thing that comes up sometimes. There's all-in-one accounting information application software, and there's modularized, excuse me, I always have trouble saying that. And, do I need, so some small companies, when we talked about how they use technology, they might go out and just buy an invoicing system. You hear those ads all the time on the radio about, do you need to automate your invoicing? And it's just an invoicing module. Most companies in the end need something in its totality. So they might buy more than one module, but it is, for a startup, it's not unrealistic. They just get one module and then the CPAs come in and look and construct the financial statements from that. So there's a lot of different ways also, besides requisitioning and buying accounting software directly, you could end up acquiring it through merger, acquisition, and other growth opportunities. And that to me was, I remember one company that I worked at was merged with another. It was bought out actually, and they had two different systems. So for a while there, on one desk, was access to one system and another desk was an access to another. And I kind of slid my chair back and forth between the two until I came up with how we were going to bring these together and what we were going to do. And usually it isn't something you can do overnight too. Sometimes you have to evolve these systems. And we'll talk about things like, why implementations fail. Are you going to go parallel systems? Are you going to go big bang, right? When you do these kind of transitions. But we don't always assume that everything within the AIS environment that you will have to manage or be involved with comes from your direct choice, right? Sometimes it kind of just lands on your lap, right? And then you have to decide what to do. System integration was probably one of the biggest changes, right, that has come in. I mentioned earlier, if you look in old AIS books, you'll see the spaghetti, right? That's all your legacy systems. Here's my time and billing system. Here's my AR system. Here's my AP. We used to call them best of breed, right? Because people go out and they'd say they didn't think they had to talk to each other, or they thought it was okay for people to rely on people to do the transfer of the data from one system to another. And as a business grows, that just isn't possible, right? So the time of integration in the 90s and the 2000s, where you're bringing all these systems together, right? And this is where we had the development of, ERPs. And this is where we had the development of ERPs. And ERPs are enterprise resource planning systems. We talked in our first chapter about systems now capture not just transactions, but they capture processes and they capture information events. And this is where you started to see this evolve when we went from unique independent systems to ones that were configured together. They could have been centralized, meaning we were all talking to the main computer. Some of you may remember that era, where big computer room, everything was going through this one processing center. Then we went basically to decentralized and distributed networks, where we're talking to, and we don't need to know all the fine details in this, but we're talking to nodes, or we're talking to computer, right? And we're not waiting or being held up by that one central computer. So we have a lot of different access, and we have a lot of different access to different software applications. So if we look down to this ERP image, we can see that we're not just dealing with just the financial, right? So that was the biggest concept for me when I was adopting these systems. And the one that I worked with was NetSuite at the time. Two of them, I've worked with several of them, but NetSuite was probably the last one. But that's where, you're used to going in and seeing the subsidiary ledgers, AR, AP, payroll, right? The general ledger. That's all the financial area. And all of a sudden there was this module called CRM, Customer Relations Management. And it's like, well, what is this about? Well, this is kind of the informational side of your AR, right? It's the one that gives you data about your customers, gives you insight into their buying habits, right? Things of that nature. And then the next thing you know, if you're in the production environment, you had your production modules and you had your supply chain management modules. So we're starting to combine the financial, the heart of the general ledger, so to speak, the debits and credits, related to all the other operations in the business. So ERPs really have become a thing. So early on too, and even now, some of them are so flexible, and that when you go into them, you may not even feel you're in an accounting system. You feel like you're in an interview system where it's asking you questions, and through your responses to the questions, you're actually recording transactions and developing things. So that is probably another change that I would talk about that you should be aware of in the accounting softwares too. If you have been in the industry before, you may have worked at companies that had general ledger numbers, right? If you go into QuickBooks now, most of the time companies set it up where you don't even see the general ledger, right? You don't see account numbers, you just see titles, and you don't see the debits and credits behind the scene. So that's why, too, we study some of that stuff early on so that we can see, right, or understand what is happening behind our new looking AIS systems. So we talked about then that you could, inherit your accounting system, which is very often the case. And then you're going to have to make some decisions on how you shift and you change and how you're going to bring it into your own control and how you're going to make it a system that truly takes data and turns it into information. And that's the last comment I want to make about chapter 4, because so many times when we're new to this discipline, we give our supervisors or our bosses, we give them data dumps, right? We're like, oh yeah, first of all, in AIS, the weakness is we have a tendency to focus on the gathering part of the accounting cycle and not enough on the output part, the report part. And that is very, very important now because we're going to see throughout this course why we're doing the type of special work we're doing in other softwares for visualization and things like that. Is managers today do not want raw data dumps. They do not want to see columns in Excel. They want to see infographics. They want to see highly summarized data so they can very quickly make their decisions. And that has come into our purview in AIS. So that's just a little explanation why we're doing some of these things. So we're doing it to change a data into information for decision making.